I have spent enough time inside the machinery of American power to recognize the sound of confidence and to recognize its opposite. What struck me about the recent reaction attributed to Scott Bessent was not its substance, but its tone. Power that is secure rarely feels the need to prove its certainty. It explains, it reassures, it absorbs disagreement without panic. What we are seeing now is something else, a defensive reflex from an institutional order that senses its assumptions are being tested by reality. For decades, the dominance of the U.S. dollar has been treated in Washington less as a responsibility than as a birthright. It became background noise, something so embedded in the system that policymakers stopped explaining it even to themselves. The dollar was strong because it always had been. Allies aligned because they always had. Markets trusted U.S. leadership because there was no alternative. That complacency was not ideological. It was bureaucratic. It seeped into how decisions were made, how risks were dismissed, and how allies were spoken to rather than listened to. When long-standing partners begin exploring alternatives, when conversations about diversification move from academic journals into cabinet rooms, the instinctive response in Washington is often outrage disguised as patriotism. The framing becomes emotional, betrayal, ingratitude, disloyalty, but those words reveal more about the speaker than the supposed offender. Allies do not wake up one morning and decide to undermine the global financial system out of spite. They respond to patterns, to unpredictability, to sanctions that feel less like law enforcement and more like political leverage, to domestic volatility in the United States that turns long-term commitments into election cycle bargaining chips. I've watched this dynamic play out before. After September 11, fear reshaped decision-making. After 2008, crisis management became permanent governance. After 2016, norm-breaking was normalized as authenticity. Each phase left scars on institutional trust, not just at home, but abroad. What looks like an outburst today is really the accumulated pressure of those unresolved moments. This is not about one official or one comment. It is about a system unused to being questioned by the very partners it once reassured. Anxiety enters when power realizes it may need to earn trust again rather than assume it. One of the most enduring myths in Washington is that the dominance of the U.S. dollar is a natural fact, like gravity or geography, rather than what it actually is, a political institution built deliberately, maintained carefully, and therefore vulnerable to neglect. I learned this not from textbooks, but from watching how much daily discipline it took to sustain trust when I worked inside government. The dollar's power was never just about size or strength. It was about credibility, predictability, and the belief that the United States understood the difference between authority and impulse. After World War II, the dollar became central to the global system, not because America demanded it, but because allies needed something stable after catastrophe. Bretton Woods formalized that trust, but trust itself did the real work. It was reinforced by independent institutions, a rules-based legal system, open capital markets, and a political culture that, however imperfectly, treated commitments as binding beyond a single administration. The dollar functioned as a public good, and the United States benefited precisely because it behaved as its steward rather than its owner. That distinction has eroded over time. When financial power is treated as leverage first and responsibility second, confidence quietly begins to fray. The increased reliance on sanctions, the politicization of trade policy, and the normalization of brinkmanship around debt ceilings and government shutdowns all send signals. None of them alone breaks the system. Together, they alter how rational actors calculate risk. Institutions don't collapse from one bad decision. They weaken when accumulated behavior contradicts their founding logic. What often goes unspoken in Washington is that reserve currency status imposes constraints. It requires restraint in rhetoric, continuity in policy, and respect for process, even when it is inconvenient. It means understanding that allies are not captive markets, but voluntary participants in a shared architecture. When U.S. leaders speak as if alternatives to the dollar are illegitimate by definition, they reveal a misunderstanding of how institutional power actually works. The dollar does not endure because it must. It endures because others believe the system surrounding it remains fair, stable and governed by law rather than mood. Once that belief wavers, diversification is not rebellion, it is prudent. And prudence in global finance is always contagious. When I worked inside the White House, one of the quiet disciplines of power was alliance management. It was rarely glamorous. It involved patience, predictability, and a willingness to absorb short-term political costs in the service of long-term stability. Allies were not treated as extensions of American will, but as partners whose consent had to be maintained, not assumed. Over time, that discipline faded, replaced by something louder and far more corrosive, transactional pressure masquerading as strength. This shift did not happen overnight. It emerged gradually as domestic politics began to crowd out strategic thinking. Trade policy became a tool for signaling toughness to voters rather than sustaining systems. Sanctions, once carefully calibrated instruments of last resort, became routine expressions of displeasure. Diplomatic continuity gave way to leader-centric volatility, where commitments were framed as favors and alliances, as debts owed to Washington, rather than shared investments in order. From the inside, this change was subtle at first. Meetings that once centered on reassurance and coordination began to revolve around leverage and compliance. The language shifted. We talked less about mutual obligations and more about what partners were getting from the United States. That rhetorical shift mattered because language shapes expectation. When allies hear that their value is measured transaction by transaction, they adjust accordingly. They hedge, they diversify. They plan for instability not because they want to defect, but because they can no longer rely on steadiness. What makes this moment dangerous is not that allies are exploring alternatives, but that Washington seems surprised they would. That surprise reveals how deeply entitlement replaced stewardship. Power was no longer something to be exercised carefully. It was something to be asserted publicly. The performance of dominance became more important than the maintenance of trust. And in global finance, trust is the currency that matters most. Transactionalism also flattened moral distinctions. When everything is framed as a deal, rules feel optional and norms feel negotiable. That mindset bleeds outward. Allies watching the United States threaten tariffs one day and promise partnership the next begin to question whether institutional commitments will survive political mood swings. They don't need speeches about loyalty. They need evidence of continuity. This is how alliance systems weaken without formal rupture. No treaty is torn up. No dramatic exit is announced. Instead, partners quietly prepare for a world in which American pressure replaces American leadership. The consequences of that shift are not immediate, but they are structural, and once they set in, they are very difficult to reverse. From Washington, it is tempting to narrate Canada's deepening economic engagement with China as a political statement, or worse, a betrayal. That framing misunderstands both Canada and the moment we are in. Ottawa is not defecting from the West. It is responding to volatility emanating from its closest ally. Canada's calculation is not ideological, it is institutional, and it is shaped by lived experience. For most of the post-war era, Canada built its economic strategy on a simple assumption, that the United States would be a stable, rules-based anchor. Disagreements were expected, even sharp ones, but they unfolded within a predictable framework. That assumption was shaken not by China's rise, but by America's behavior. The renegotiation of NAFTA under the shadow of tariff threats, the casual weaponization of trade disputes, and the willingness to treat bilateral relationships as leverage points rather than shared systems forced Canadian policymakers to confront a reality they had long tried to avoid. Overdependence carries risk when the partner becomes unpredictable. China, in this context, is less a destination than a hedge. Canadian officials understand the political, human rights, and security complexities of dealing with Beijing. They are not naive about them, but they are equally aware that diversification is a rational response to concentrated exposure. Middle powers survive by spreading risk, not by staking their futures on assurances that may not outlast an election cycle south of their border. What often goes unacknowledged in Washington is how humiliating uncertainty can be for allies. Being publicly threatened with tariffs on national security grounds, being told that long-standing trade relationships are unfair, being asked to renegotiate settled agreements under duress, these experiences linger. They shape institutional memory. And institutions, like people, learn from experience. Canada's outreach to China is not an embrace of authoritarianism. It is an insurance policy against American volatility. When U.S. officials react with anger rather than introspection, they miss the lesson. This is not about Canada choosing China over the United States. It is about Canada choosing resilience over dependency. The deeper democratic consequence is this. When allies feel compelled to hedge against American unpredictability, the architecture of trust that sustained U.S. leadership weakens, not because others are hostile, but because they are prudent. And prudence, once normalized, quietly rewrites the map of power. One of the most corrosive forces acting on American democracy right now is not secrecy, but distortion. I've watched how complex, slow-moving institutional shifts are flattened by media incentives into moments of outrage that feel urgent but explain very little. When allies adjust their economic strategies, the story that travels fastest is not the careful one. It is the emotional one. Someone is ditching America. Someone is turning to China. Loyalty becomes the frame, and analysis disappears. This is not an accident. The modern media ecosystem rewards speed, conflict, and moral clarity that can be consumed instantly. Structural erosion does not perform well on television. It requires context, patience, and a willingness to assign responsibility across time rather than to a single actor. So instead, viewers are offered villains and betrayals. The audience is invited to feel wronged, not informed. That emotional substitution is dangerous because it misdirects accountability. I've sat on both sides of this dynamic. I know how political actors exploit media incentives to deflect from institutional failure. When Washington reacts defensively to allied diversification, it is far easier to blame foreign disloyalty than to interrogate domestic volatility, policy incoherence, or the erosion of norms that made hedging rational in the first place. Media coverage that amplifies this framing does not challenge power, it shields it. The illusion of sudden disloyalty also erases time. It suggests that trust evaporated overnight, rather than acknowledging the years of tariff threats, sanction expansion, debt ceiling crises, and leader-driven unpredictability that accumulated quietly. By collapsing cause and effect into a single news cycle, the public is denied an accurate diagnosis. And without diagnosis, there is no correction. This distortion has democratic consequences. When citizens are trained to see global politics as a series of personal affronts rather than institutional responses, they become more susceptible to grievance-based narratives at home. The same logic applies domestically. Norms don't erode because people announce they are done with democracy. They erode because incentives reward spectacle over stewardship. The media does not create these failures, but it can normalize them. By treating allied caution as hostility, it reinforces the politics of entitlement rather than accountability. And entitlement, once internalized, makes democratic self-correction feel like weakness instead of necessity. To understand why the global financial system is fragmenting now, you have to revisit what changed after 2008. The financial crisis did not just expose market excesses. It altered the relationship between states, markets, and trust. Emergency measures became permanent architecture. Central banks assumed extraordinary roles. And the promise that globalization would steadily converge toward stability quietly gave way to a reality of managed risk and political improvisation. In the years that followed, the United States used its financial centrality to stabilize the system, but it also learned how powerful that centrality could be as a tool. Sanctions became broader, faster, and more embedded in financial plumbing. Access to dollar clearing and U.S.-linked systems turned into a mechanism of enforcement well beyond traditional security threats. Each use was justified in isolation, each was legal, but together they taught other governments an important lesson. Dependence creates vulnerability. At the same time, domestic dysfunction in the United States became visible to the world. Repeated debt ceiling crises signaled that even core obligations could become bargaining chips. Quantitative easing on a massive scale reshaped capital flows and asset prices, benefiting some economies while destabilizing others. From the outside, this did not look like stewardship. It looked like unilateralism masked as necessity. Financial fragmentation is not a rebellion against the United States. It is an adaptation to a system that increasingly feels politicized. Countries began exploring local currency swaps, alternative payment systems, and regional financial arrangements, not because the dollar failed, but because reliance on a single node appeared risky in a world of sanctions, polarization, and policy whiplash. What makes this moment different is that fragmentation is no longer theoretical. It is incremental, pragmatic, and quietly institutional. No one is announcing the end of the dollar. They are building redundancy, and redundancy, once normalized, changes power dynamics in ways that speeches cannot reverse. This matters for democracy because economic order and political legitimacy are intertwined. When global finance fragments, coordination becomes harder, crisis response becomes slower, and mistrust becomes the default. The system becomes less resilient, not more. And the country that once benefited most from integration finds itself increasingly reacting rather than leading. Fragmentation is the shadow cast by a post-2008 world that never truly resolved its contradictions. It is the cost of treating emergency power as a permanent entitlement. The most dangerous consequence of this moment is not that the United States may lose some measure of financial dominance. It is that we have begun to confuse power with entitlement, and in doing so have weakened the democratic habits that once sustained both. I've seen how this confusion takes root. It starts when institutions stop explaining themselves, when leaders stop persuading and start asserting, when accountability feels optional because authority feels inherited. Democracy depends on the discipline of justification. Power must be defended not just as effective, but as legitimate. When U.S. leaders react to global diversification with indignation rather than self-examination, they model a form of governance that resents scrutiny. That posture does not stay confined to foreign policy. It travels inward. Citizens absorb the lesson that challenge equals disloyalty, and that institutions deserve obedience rather than oversight. Treating global leadership as a birthright also corrodes reform. If power is assumed to be permanent, there is little incentive to maintain the norms that made it possible. The slow erosion of congressional authority over trade, the normalization of emergency economic powers, and the willingness to weaponize institutions for short-term political gain all reflect this mindset. None of these changes arrives as coups. They arrive as precedents. And precedents, once set, rarely stay confined to their original context. I've watched how entitlement reshapes media narratives, turning accountability into hostility and caution into weakness. I've watched how it reshapes public expectations, lowering the bar for institutional behavior while raising tolerance for norm breaking. This is how democratic erosion feels from the inside. Not dramatic, but dull. Not sudden, but accumulative. The irony is that democratic strength and global leadership have always drawn from the same source: credibility. When the United States demonstrated restraint, respected process, and honored commitments beyond political convenience, others followed. When it stopped doing those things, they adapted. That adaptation is not an attack, it is a verdict. The future of American democracy will not be decided by whether the dollar remains dominant or whether allies hedge. It will be decided by whether we remember that power must be renewed through accountability, humility, and institutional care. Entitlement cannot sustain democracy. Only stewardship can.